The lion lay in the dust, one leg twisted unnaturally where a length of steel wire bit into the flesh. His chest rose unevenly, each breath shallow, each exhale carrying the weight of long hours caught in silence. The snare, set by poachers for smaller prey, had not been built for an animal of his size, yet the wire had done its work all the same, tightening with every struggle until now his strength was nearly gone. His mane, once full and proud, clung with sweat and dust. His eyes, dulled from exhaustion, followed movement without focus. This was not the picture of a hunter at his peak. It was fragile, stark, and unguarded, lying exposed on the open ground of Chavo. From the ridge above, Kamau, one of the reserve rangers, had been the first to see him. He did not rush. He did not call out. He only lifted a hand to the others and began a slow descent. Every step carried a calculation. How close could they come before panic outweighed fatigue? Before the lion gathered what remained of his power for one last desperate fight. The men knew the risk clearly. If he thrashed, the wire would cut deeper. If he fled, he would bleed out in the bush. If they hesitated, he would die where he lay. The air around them was hot, heavy with the stillness that falls just before dusk. Insects hovered above the lion's wound, drawn to the faint trace of blood. The leg was swollen badly, the skin split raw where metal pressed against bone. His tail twitched once, then stilled. Even this small movement drew a sharp pull from the wire. His body recoiled weakly at the pain, then slumped back into the dust. Kamau raised a quiet hand to signal pause. The silence pressed close, and in it, the truth was plain. They had little time. Another ranger, Lamech, circled wide, moving to close the angle. He carried only a coil of rope and a long pole, nothing sharp, nothing loud. Their work was measured by patience, not force. The lion turned his head fractionally toward him, pupils narrowing against the low sun. For a moment his lips trembled, the ghost of a growl that never came. He had no energy to roar. That absence was more frightening than sound. A lion without a voice is a lion at the edge of life. Kamau stopped within 20 paces, crouching low, letting the animal see every motion. He whispered softly, not words of command, just sound to steady the air between them. His eyes did not leave the lion's chest, watching the rise and fall. The breaths were uneven, the rhythm breaking as if his body debated whether to continue. Every falter restated the stakes. If they delayed, this lion's breath would be his last. The first decisive act came not from the men but from the lion himself. He tried once to pull free, pressing against the snare with the last of his weight. The wire snapped tight, cutting deeper. His head lifted, then dropped with a hollow thud against the ground. The men froze. Hearts steady but hands ready. That attempt marked the line. His fight was gone. What remained was surrender, not of will, but of a body past its strength. Kamau gave the signal. The team shifted closer, every motion deliberate, quiet, controlled. They would not cut the wire tonight, not yet. They needed him still long enough to act without panic. But the first steps had been made. The lion was seen. The danger was named, and his life, balanced now between the slow bleed of the snare and the careful reach of human hands, hung in silence over the dust of Tsavo. The lion shifted, muscles trembling as he tried to lift himself from the ground. His body heaved once, front legs pushing forward, but the trapped hind leg dragged him down again. Dust lifted around his mane as he collapsed heavily, the breath leaving his chest in a ragged burst. He stayed there, chest pressed to the earth, head lowered, eyes half closed. A second attempt came moments later, shorter, weaker. He rose no higher than a crouch before the steel cut into his flesh again, forcing him down with sharp finality. Each movement risked tearing the wound open further. Each collapse drove home the same truth. If he kept fighting the wire, his strength would be gone before the men could act. Kamau moved slowly across the clearing, one hand lifted in a calm signal to the others. He spoke under his breath, the sound quiet, low, and steady, carrying no command, only presence. His words mattered less than his tone. The lion's ear twitched faintly, catching the murmur, though his eyes did not lift. The rangers had seen this before. A lion too weak to roar, too weak to stand, was closer to death than life. Yet even now, one sudden movement could ignite panic. And if panic took him, the wire would cut through tendons and arteries alike. Lamech stood to Kamau's left, rope coiled in his hands. Another ranger stayed to the right, his pole angled low. No weapons, no raised voices. Everything they carried was meant to guide and restrain without harm. Still, the margin for error was razor-thin. Kamau stepped again, slow, eyes steady on the lion's chest. The breaths were shallow, uneven, each one stalling before the next came. They could not rush, but they could not wait. Waiting meant blood loss, infection, the body's slow surrender. The lion stirred once more. His head lifted briefly, mane clotted with dust and sweat, and his eyes found Kamau. The pupils narrowed sharply, not in strength but in recognition. For one long second, predator and man stared across the dry clearing, both aware of the fragility that bound them. The lion let out a faint rumble, more air than voice, then lowered his head again to the ground. It was not a submission. It was exhausting. Still, the message was clear. One wrong step, and even in weakness he could lash out. Kamau whispered again. "Easy." The word was soft. Meant as much for his team as for the animal. Lamech held back, rope still slack in his hands. If they moved too soon, they risked a final burst of struggle. If they moved too late, they would lose him. The balance was delicate, almost invisible, stretched between fear and trust. Another attempt came, slower than the first. The lion dragged his body forward an inch, then stopped, sides heaving. His paw scraped against the dust, claws digging shallow lines before going slack. His strength was unraveling with every effort. Kamau used that pause. He took another step closer, crouched low, his free hand hovering over the earth. The lion's eyes flickered once, then closed halfway, a signal of weariness rather than calm. It was enough. The rangers shifted carefully into a tighter arc. Lamech angled left, the third man angled right, their ropes poised but not yet thrown. Every part of the air around them was charged with risk. The lion's next choice could turn calm into chaos in a heartbeat. If he lunged, the wire would tear deep, and the men would not be able to stop the bleeding. If he stayed down, they had a chance to reach him, to end the trap without ending his life. The dust settled over the quiet clearing, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The lion did not rise again. His body lay still, only the faint tremor of his sides marking life. Kamau's voice, steady and calm, filled the silence in measured cadence. Fear had not vanished, but it was held, suspended in the air like breath not yet released. And in that suspension, trust began. Not certainty, not safety, but the smallest shift. Enough to try, enough to begin. The rangers tightened their formation as the lion lay stretched in the dirt, the glint of wire still taut around his leg. The decision was clear now. Waiting longer meant certain death. Action had to be taken, but every motion needed to be measured. Deliberate, controlled. Kamau signaled with a nod, and Lamech uncoiled the first rope, its rough fiber sliding quietly through his hands. Another ranger, Musa, lifted a long pole tipped with a loop, the kind used to guide and hold without cutting. No one raised their voice. No one hurried. In this moment, calm was the only weapon they carried. The lion stirred as the pole edged closer. His paw jerked violently once, claws scraping the ground, sending a puff of dust into the air. The thrash tightened the wire against his flesh, and a sharp tremor of pain rippled through his body. He growled faintly, though it was more a rasp than a roar, and then the paw fell slack again, the energy spent in an instant. His strength was waning, but even weakness carried danger. One desperate strike could tangle rope, break bone, or cut him deeper still. Kamau whispered, voice low and steady, "Easy now." Sweat streaked down his temples and arms, not from fear alone, but from the weight of the late sun pressing hard across the clearing. The heat hung heavy, and shadows stretched long over the lion's body, tracing his ribs and mane. Every detail sharpened in their eyes, the quiver of his flank, the rise and fall of his chest, the wound swollen tight around steel. If he tore it open further, the blood loss would end him before dawn. Musa eased the pole forward, slipping the loop over the lion's front paw. Kamau crouched lower, guiding the motion with one hand, as if to steady both man and beast. The loop tightened gently, holding the paw against sudden thrash. The lion reacted with a short heave of his chest, another futile surge of resistance, but the effort quickly dissolved. The rope held him, not harshly but firmly enough to still reach his reach. That restraint gave them a window, a chance to keep him alive. Lamech moved next, tossing his rope with quiet precision toward the hind leg not caught in the wire. The coil landed, missed, then was drawn back carefully without rush. A second cast looped true, settling over the limb. He pulled it taut, anchoring himself against a low tree. Now 2 of the lion's legs were under controlled tension. Not forceful, not cruel, but necessary to prevent further damage. The animal groaned softly, the sound of frustration more than fight, and lowered his head again to the dust. Kamau edged closer, watching the lion's eyes. They were still open, tracking faintly, dulled by exhaustion, yet not blind to movement. Kamau kept speaking softly, a rhythm of sound as steady as his breathing. Each whisper was less for command and more to remind the lion of presence, an anchor in the haze of fear. His hand trembled once, then steadied as he reached for Musa's pole. Together they secured another limb until 3 legs were held. The trapped hind leg, swollen and raw around the wire, remained untouched. That would come last, and it would be the hardest. The air thickened with urgency. Every minute the wire stayed in place, blood flow slowed and tissue died. Infection was already likely, but if they freed him now, there was still a chance. Kamau felt the pressure of time in the sweat sliding down his back, in the ache of his knees, crouched low. The sun slipped lower, shadows stretching long fingers across the ground, marking the narrowing window they had left. The lion lifted his head suddenly, eyes flaring with one last pulse of instinct. His body jerked against the ropes, a brief storm of muscle and will. Dust rose, ropes strained, and the men held their ground. Then as quickly as it came, the fight fell silent. His head dropped hard against the earth, his body sagging under its own weight. The ropes held steady, keeping him still without breaking him. His breaths shuddered but continued. The danger had not passed, but the balance was holding. Every second mattered. Kamau knew it. If the lion tore the flesh further, the leg could not be saved, and without his leg he could not hunt. Without hunting, he could not live. The stakes were plain, sharp as the steel cutting into his body. For now, though, the ropes held, the team held, and the lion still breathed. That was enough to move forward. That was enough to try. The moment had narrowed to a single task. The ropes held steady. 3 limbs secured in calm restraint, the 4th swollen and bound in steel. The lion's body lay stretched in the dirt, chest rising unevenly, his breaths shallow but stubborn. Kamau motioned quietly to Lamech, who stepped forward with a pair of heavy cutters, the steel jaws dulled from years of use but sharp enough for what was needed now. No one rushed. No one spoke above a whisper. One wrong sound could push the lion into another surge of panic, and a single surge could tear his leg beyond saving. The cutters slid into place, pressing against the thick wire embedded deep in flesh. Kamau crouched low, one hand steady on the rope line, the other raised slightly toward the lion's head. His voice came in a whisper, quiet and steady. "Easy now." The lion's eyes shifted once, glassy but aware. His paw twitched faintly, a weak resistance that quickly fell still. Lamech closed the handles in one slow squeeze. The metal resisted, groaning under pressure, then snapped clean with a sharp crack. The wire recoiled, ends curling back against the dirt. The leg it bound fell slack. Free for the first time in hours, maybe longer. The lion did not leap up. He did not roar. He only lay where he was, chest heaving in sudden release. Blood seeped heavily from the wound, staining the dust dark beneath him. The smell of iron and earth thickened in the air. Yet, for the first time since they had found him, there was no steel cutting deeper with each movement. The danger was not gone, but its hold was broken. The rescuers froze, waiting. Freedom, they knew, could be as dangerous as capture. A lion, startled in this state, might thrash against his bindings, tearing himself apart before they could intervene. Every eye locked on his chest, counting the rhythm of his breaths. They were uneven, ragged, but steady. That steadiness was hope. His head lifted once, weakly, then dropped again, mane falling across the blood-stained ground. Kamau kept his voice low. "Stay." It was less command than wish, spoken into the heavy air between them. He motioned for Musa to keep the ropes taut but not pulling. The lion needed stillness now more than restraint. Every second mattered. If he surged to his feet, blood would spill faster. If he stayed still, they might yet save him. The line was that thin. The sun lowered beyond the ridge, throwing long shadows across the clearing. They stretched over the lion's ribs, turning each rise and fall into a mark of survival. Flies swarmed the wound immediately, their buzzing harsh in the stillness. Lamech brushed them away with the edge of his shirt, his hands steady though his arms shook from heat and strain. The flesh around the cut was raw, swollen, edges pulled wide from hours of pressure. Infection was certain without treatment, but the immediate threat was blood loss. Kamau pressed a cloth gently near the wound, careful not to provoke sudden motion. The lion flinched once, a low rumble vibrating in his chest, but did not rise. Minutes passed, though they felt stretched thin. The ropes held quietly, the men knelt in patience, and the lion breathed on, chest rising, chest falling. Stillness, for the first time, was not defeat but relief. The steel was gone. The danger had shifted, but it had not ended. He could still live if he did not waste himself in fear. When Kamau finally leaned back, sweat darkening his shirt, he let his hand fall to the earth. The work was not finished, but the hardest part was behind them. The wire was severed. The leg, though torn and bleeding, was still his. What remained now was waiting, watching to see if the lion would trust the quiet or turn it into chaos. For men and lions alike, survival rested on what came next. The light faded quickly over the plains, the heat of the day slipping into the cool hush of evening. The lion had not moved since the wire was cut. His body lay stretched in the dirt, chest lifting with heavy effort, each breath rasping out with a sound like dry wind against stone. The ropes still held his limbs steady, though now they were slack, more a guide than a restraint. His leg, freed from steel, bled slowly into the dust. Every drop marked the ground with the price of survival. The rangers kept their distance for a time, waiting for signs of panic or strength, but none came. The lion only breathed, eyes dull, mane tangled and still. As the sun slid beneath the horizon, Kamau made his choice. They could not leave him without water. Hours caught in the snare had drained him, the struggle and heat stealing whatever reserves of strength remained. Without water tonight, the cut wire would mean nothing. He would not see the morning. Kamau lifted a metal pan from his pack, dented and worn from years in the field. He filled it slowly from a canteen, the sound of water trickling against steel soft in the gathering dark. Every man in the clearing knew what was at risk. If the lion startled, if he rose suddenly in fear, he could bleed out in his frenzy. Yet if they held back, he might never recover enough to rise again. Kamau moved on his knees, inch by inch, never rushing. His voice came low and steady, not command, not plea, only presence. Easy. The word drifted in the dusk air, meant to settle both men and animals. The lion stirred faintly, his head shifting just enough to catch the sound. His ears flicked once, then stilled. Kamau set the shallow pan on the earth within reach of the lion's muzzle. For a long breath, nothing happened. The pan gleamed faintly in the last traces of light, untouched. Then, with slow effort, the lion lifted his head. The motion was unsteady, muscles trembling beneath his mane. His nose lowered toward the pan, lips parting as if to test the scent. For a heartbeat, Kamau thought he might recoil, but instead the lion's tongue touched the water. The first sip was clumsy, his jaw shaking faintly, droplets spilling into the dust. He paused, chest heaving, then leaned again. Another sip, steadier this time. His throat moved as the water passed, and the sound was small but unmistakable, the sound of life taking hold again. No roar came, no strike of paw or sudden lunge. There was only a quiet need. Kamau stayed motionless, watching, the sweat cooling on his skin as the lion drank. In that moment, the weight of risk shifted. For hours, survival had meant restraint, control, keeping predator and human apart by ropes and distance. Now, survival was shared. A man offering water, a lion accepting it. The line between them blurred, not in trust, not in friendship, but in something simpler. The fact that both wanted him to live. The other rangers stood silent at the edges of the clearing. Musa exhaled softly, though he had not realized he'd been holding his breath. Lamek wiped his brow, eyes fixed on the pan as if watching proof of the impossible. The lion drank again, longer this time, the tremor in his jaw easing. When he lifted his head, water clung to the fur around his mouth, catching the last trace of light before darkness swallowed it. He let out a long, slow breath and lowered his head to the ground once more. Eyes half closed, body slack with exhaustion. Kamau did not reach for the pan again. He only left it there, half full, close enough for the lion to find if he stirred in the night. The ropes would be loosened when dawn came, but for now stillness was their only safety. Around them, the reserve quieted into night, crickets rising in chorus, the air cooling with steady calm. The lion's breathing slowed, no longer frantic but heavy, steady, deliberate. The boundary had been crossed quietly, without ceremony. A predator had taken water from a human hand, and the human had knelt not as captor, not as conqueror, but as witness to survival. For both, the night would hold. What came after, only the morning would decide. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the reserve, touching the clearing with pale gold. The men had kept their watch through the night, listening to the rhythm of the lion's breathing as it steadied, slowed, and held. The ropes had been loosened in the dark, no longer taut, but lying slack around his limbs, ready to fall free with the smallest shift. The pan of water sat empty now, overturned where his muzzle had brushed it aside after drinking. Around him, the dust was stained with blood, darker patches marking where the wire had bitten deepest. Yet still, his chest rose. Still, he lived. When the air began to cool in the morning, the lion stirred. It was not sudden. His flank twitched once, then twice, before a deeper breath shuddered through his body. His head lifted slowly from the dirt, mane heavy with dew. His ears flicked against the faint buzz of insects. For long minutes he simply stayed like that, gathering strength, his eyes half closed against the low sun. The men did not move, not even to whisper. They knew what was at stake. If he could not stand, infection and weakness would take him within days. If he forced himself too soon, the wound might tear open and bleed him dry. Survival balanced on what happened next. With effort, he pushed forward on his front legs. The motion was labored, shoulders trembling under his weight, but they held. Dust shifted beneath his paws, pressed down by the return of strength. For a moment he paused, chest heaving, then drew his hind legs under him. The freed leg shook violently, muscles quivering against pain and loss of power. His body sagged as if it would fall, then steadied. He forced weight onto it, first lightly, then fully. The men watched, every breath caught in their chests. If the leg failed, he would collapse into the dirt. If it held, he would stand again. Slowly, impossibly, he rose. His frame lifted from the ground until he was upright, tall and trembling in the soft light. Every muscle quivered under the strain, his body wavering but not falling. The ropes slipped from his limbs and lay forgotten in the dust. He stood alone now, no wire, no restraint, no hand upon him. The wound glistened raw against his flank, blood still seeping, but the leg bore him. However weak, however uncertain, it bore him. Kamau let out a breath he had been holding since the lion's first stir. He did not move closer. None of the rangers did. Their role is finished now. What remained was for the lion alone to choose. He lifted his head higher, mane catching the light, and his eyes found the men. For a moment he held their gaze, steady, unreadable, unbroken. There was no gratitude there, no threat, only recognition. They had seen him at his weakest, and now they watched him rise. He turned then, slow and deliberate, toward the line of bush beyond the clearing. His gait was uneven, the injured leg dragging faintly, but each step was placed with intent. He did not stumble. He did not falter. His body swayed with effort, yet his direction was clear. This was not an escape. There was no panic in his movement, no desperate flight from men who had bound him. It was returned, to cover, to shadow, to the rhythm of the wild that had always been his. The men remained still, their silence thick with what they had witnessed. The lion crossed the edge of the clearing, tail low, steps slow but determined. For a final breath, his shape lingered in the light framed by dust and early sun. Then he slipped into the brush, swallowed by the land that had nearly lost him. Only the blood-stained ground remained, marked with paw prints and coils of broken rope. Kamau knelt once, pressing his hand into the earth where the lion had lain. The prince led away, uneven but unbroken, carrying a truth no words could hold. Against wire, against weakness, against all chance, he had stood. The days passed quietly after the rescue, the memory of the lion lingering with the men long after his shape had vanished into the bush. By the third morning, Kamau returned alone to the clearing, drawn back not by duty but by the weight of unfinished presence. The sun was just beginning its climb, warming the dust where the struggle had unfolded. He walked without hurry, following the faint trail that led through scrub and thorn, the signs still fresh enough for a trained eye to read. The ground bore its story plainly. There, pressed deep into the soil, lay the heavy imprint of paws, uneven, staggered, one dragging behind the others. The marks told of his first steps into freedom, unsteady but determined. A faint line cut through the dust beside them where the tail had dragged, low and heavy with exhaustion. Kamau crouched near the impressions, tracing the pattern with his eyes. They led toward the bush, steadying with distance, proof that the lion had walked on. Just beyond the place where he had lain, the earth still carried darker stains. The blood had dried now, the harsh color fading into rust against the pale soil. Around it the dust was disturbed, scuffed by rope, by human boots, by the shifting of a body caught between death and release. Time had softened the edges, but the story remained, a place where a lion had nearly ended, and yet had risen instead. Kamau stood and moved toward the shade of a nearby acacia. The roots curled above the earth in thick tangles, and there, caught deep among them, lay the broken snare. The steel was twisted, its sharp edge curled back where the cutters had bitten through. It had not been removed, left instead as a marker of what had held him. Kamau lifted it free, feeling the weight in his hands. It was not heavy, not compared to the life it had threatened. He turned it once in the light, the steel glinting dully, then set it back in the roots. Some things were better left in the open, not hidden away. The clearing itself was silent now. No vultures circled overhead, no scavengers had claimed the ground. The stillness was not empty but full, a quiet that carried its own answer. The lion had not died here. He had walked away. His story continued beyond the brush, unseen but alive. Kamau stood in that silence for a long time, letting it settle into him. Every mark on the ground was temporary, but the meaning was lasting. The wind shifted once, stirring dust across the prints until they blurred faintly at the edges. Soon they would vanish entirely, erased by weather, by time, by the endless movement of the reserve. Only the snare would remain, half buried in roots, a relic of both cruelty and survival. Kamau let his gaze travel across the bush line where the lion had disappeared days before. There was no sign of him now, no movement, no sound. But absence was not a loss. It was proof of return. When Kamau finally turned to leave, he did not look back. The ground had told its story, and the silence had given its reply. Nothing else was needed. A lion, once bound, had walked free, and the land had taken him back. Weeks later, when the long grass had begun to bend heavily with wind and the rains hinted on the horizon, word reached the rangers of lion tracks near the southern grazing grounds. Kamau and Lemek rode out at dawn, following the curve of the ridge until the open plain stretched before them. The soil there was soft from scattered showers, perfect for holding the prints of passing animals. They dismounted quietly and walked the edge of the field, eyes scanning the ground for signs. It did not take long. Pressed into the damp earth were paw marks, deep and deliberate. They ran parallel to the hooves of wildebeest, fresh enough that the edges had not yet dried. The tracks were strong now, even, the stagger and drag of weakness gone. Kamau crouched low, studying the impressions. Each step told a truth more certain than any sighting. The lion had healed. The leg that once trembled beneath him now carried his weight without falter. He had returned to the hunt, to the rhythm of survival. They followed the prints a short distance, careful not to disturb the trail. At one point, Kamau placed his hand beside a single paw mark. The size dwarfed his own, the spread of claws etched sharp in the soil. He pictured the lion as he had been weeks before, head low, mane tangled, chest heaving against the wire. Then he looked again at the ground before him, the stride wide, the gait steady. The transformation was undeniable. A life once held by steel now moved again with power. The wildebeest tracks veered toward the east, their path cut with the urgency of migration. The lions followed close, measured but relentless. There was no chaos here, no desperation, only the plain reality of predator and prey. Kamau straightened slowly, brushing the soil from his palms. What happens next, he thought, is not for men to witness. It is not a spectacle, it is survival itself. The lion would hunt as he was born to do. He would eat, heal further, and continue. That was enough. Lemek stood beside him, silent, eyes fixed on the trail as if expecting the animal to appear from the grass at any moment. But no shape emerged, no roar carried across the plain. The lion remained unseen, his presence known only by the marks he left behind. In that absence lay the truth the rangers needed. He lived. He endured. Their work, though brief, had returned him to what he was. They lingered only a while longer, then turned back toward camp. Behind them, the wind moved gently across the plain, bending grass over the prints until they softened. Soon the trail would fade, erased as all trails are, leaving only memory. Yet memory was enough. For the men who had freed him, the silence of that night remained sharp, the moment the wire snapped, the moment water touched his lips, the moment a predator and a man shared survival in stillness. Kamau carried that silence with him as they walked. Not a silence of emptiness, but one filled with the weight of choice. A lion had chosen not to strike, not to flee, but to drink and live. That single act had bridged the gap between them, if only for a breath in time. He knew he would never forget it, not in days, not in years. Some moments carved themselves into the memory of a man, and this was one. As the sun climbed higher, the plain brightened, the grass swaying like a tide. Somewhere beyond that sea of movement, the lion walked again, strong and whole. The rangers would not see him. They did not need to. His tracks had spoken, his silence had answered. The land had taken him back, and life had continued on.